I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Real Estate Realities with the Rebel Broker. My name's Robert Whitelaw, and I am the Rebel Broker. Licensed real estate broker in the state of California, member of the National Association of Real Towers. But please, don't hold that against me. Welcome to it. Today is Friday, July 22nd, 2016. You've made it. We're at the end of another week. This one took forever. Didn't it seem like a long week? I hope all of you were able to accomplish a lot of the goals that you set for yourself at the head end of the week. I'd love to hear back from those of you who are also using the goal following tool or the goal tracking tool that's built into Google Calendar. I've mentioned it on the show here a few times, and again, I don't get any kickbacks or anything like that from Google for mentioning the product. It's just one of the few things that I've tried to integrate goal following into to-do lists and lots of other things out there. And this is really the first tool I've used that kind of keeps things at front of mind, right? And allows you to play hooky, I guess, from your goals on occasion, but then still keep them sort of on the horizon, at least in an automatic way. So make sure to check that out if you get a chance. Now, I use it on my iPhone, so I have the app downloaded, the Google Calendar app. And when I set a new thing, it asks me if it's a goal right off the bat, just like it would if it's an event or anything else. So take a look at it and see if it'll work for you. And, of course, the best way to get in contact with me is through the website at www.therebelbroker.com. Feel free to head on over there. Check out the link, Contact the Rebel Broker. Feel free to send along any ideas, suggestions, observations, or questions you might have. I'll be happy to answer those as best as I can. Kind of a change today. I'm going to bring it down a notch. I've had a couple of good shows on topics that are kind of a big deal, and I guess there's very strong opinions one direction or the other. And I know in the last week I've covered two topics that are typically very big feedback generators, I guess you could say, in terms of people who also, share my interest in the subject and also have some very strong feelings about it. And I encourage folks to reach out when we encounter those kinds of things. One thing that makes this a great tool, not just for you, is also for me. I like interacting with the folks who listen to the show and getting their feedback. And so far, it's been fantastic in terms of the ideas I've been able to exchange with folks outside the show, and then the opportunities also to take those interchanges and interactions and share them on the show with everyone else. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about what seems to be kind of a trend in terms of how things are changing for the makeup of buyers in terms of those first purchases. We've talked about over the last several months how the millennials are doing their thing, and the buying world seems to be changing. And a lot of this seems to relate to the price of homes, but also sort of the psychology, I think, that's behind buyers today, regardless of what group they're in, that's a little different than it used to be. And I think for folks who are buying and for folks who are selling and for folks who are investing, understanding this change helps to understand the people you're competing with when you're trying to buy. It helps to understand the folks that you might be serving by providing a product if you're an investor, whether you're providing a product in terms of being a home that you have remodeled. Maybe you're doing a flip. Or if you're someone who wants to have a home that you're going to rent. I think because you see a change in how people purchase a home, that also tends to change the makeup of the folks who are hanging back and continuing to rent. So I think it's good data to understand. And the change that I think we're seeing is what we already know is that folks are waiting longer to buy in a lot of cases. first-time buyers with average incomes would shop for an affordable home back in the old days, a lower-end home, a smaller house. And the idea would be that they're going to move on to a larger home in a few years. And statistics bear that out, right? Usually you moved anywhere from 3 to 5 years after that purchase of the first home. And what we're seeing is that that's not happening now as it used to. First-time home buyers are wanting homes that are going to meet their needs for a longer period of time. They're no longer thinking this'll do. So what does that end up resulting in? It ends up resulting in folks who rent longer, and that you as a renter may be able to hold on to really good renters longer by providing homes that provide a little bit more than others. Because in other words, the folks who are renting are really at that 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom place, right? But what if we see this change in dynamics and how folks are deciding to make that first buy to the point where they're waiting so that they're able to buy that home that has more than what they need? The point I'm trying to get at here is this a time when we're starting to see a transition to where folks are going to be wanting to purchase that 4-bedroom house as their first house, potentially? Now, I think 3-bedroom homes are going to still stay kind of the core staple of what everyone's looking for. But I think that potentially by having a 4-bedroom home for rent, you're kind of reaching for an itch that is becoming more dominant in the marketplace. I think that because of this waiting thing, and because buyers are trying to wait till they can get that home that fits not just what they need today, but what they anticipate they're going to need down the road, that you as a renter potentially could benefit from that dynamic and hold on to renters longer by providing that now. So I guess what we're saying here is that the mentality is switching from a buy a house that'll make do now to rent the place that'll make do now. And that's kind of an interesting shift. It's hard to really, aside from prices and aside from the fact that a lot of entry-level homes simply aren't getting built in terms of prices, right? And it's hard to describe, at least in my marketplace, a $800,000, $900,000, $1 million house as a starter house for someone. And when that price gets to a certain point, it's natural, I think, that buyers get pushed into this idea that, let's not do this every so often. Let's sit back and let's wait till we find something that we think is going to fill our needs for a long time, and potentially buy something that we're not just going to hold on to for 3 to 5 years. We're going to hold on to for 10 to 15 years, maybe even longer than that. When I think back to my clients that I've had over the last couple of years, some folks who I've consulted over the last few years as well, that does tend to be the trend here in the Bay Area. Now, obviously, that's where my ground experience comes from. People don't have the starter home chat, right? It doesn't come down to this is what we need right now. We don't care about schools because we don't have any children. We don't care about an extra bedroom because we don't have kids. We don't care about these other things because we're younger and we don't care about being near commuter stuff or other types of things. What I see are folks who are thinking those things now, and they're not thinking we're going to have kids in 5 years, so we'll worry about getting a home to fill that need then. They're thinking we may do that in 4 or 5 years or 6 years or 10 years, so we want to buy a house that will be ready for that now, which implies that kind of a length of time commitment, right, where folks are going to stay in those homes for that certain period of time. Now, first-time home buyers nowadays tend to be higher earners, and that's absolutely borne out simply because of numbers, right? In order to become a first-time buyer in a lot of markets, you don't have any choice but to be someone who's a higher earner simply because prices are that much higher. Rising home prices and tighter housing inventories are causing that to be sort of a normal dynamic in a lot of different marketplaces. Finding homes at a price range that are reasonable for what would be called an entry-level home is a difficult task. So it simply the supply and demand dynamic also pushes that up. Let's see. In 2013, first-time buyers purchased homes with an average of 1,845 square feet. The average home in the U.S., meanwhile, is just 1,819 square feet, according to BuildZoom, a real estate construction firm's analysis of data from the Census Bureau. Quote, so those home buyers who probably would have been looking for the lowest end homes 10 years ago during the housing boom are today just not able to buy. And those that are able to buy are looking further up market. And they make the point in this article, which will from Realtor.com. We'll go ahead and link this in the show notes. Many first-time home buyers aren't planning to upgrade and move in 5 years like they once did. They plan to stay put. Quote, when they do purchase, they're planning on living there longer than buyers that we've seen in the past. They're expecting to live there 10 years. That's a big change. Most of the assumptions in every part of the business world that relate to real estate are built on this idea that folks change homes on average every 3 to 5 years. Imagine what happens when that changes. Now, for us as buyers, sellers, and investors, it obviously changes the dynamic. If folks are going to stay in a buy and hold mode for longer, that bodes pretty well for renters, right? In terms of landlords being able to have renters. And also for a longer term, you're likely to get that person renting for longer. I think in general, what I'm seeing are folks just not wanting to have to move around a lot in general. And I think, again, that's another thing that plays into, if you're a landlord providing what folks need, you can get yourself a long-term, reliable renter in ways that we just didn't see just 10 years ago, where you had to be on a cycle of improving your property when someone would move out on every few years. You may not see that anymore. You may see folks who want to stay in your properties for a whole lot longer. For folks that are trying to sell, it's going to be interesting to see what dynamic this plays in terms of how it changes the marketplace. If we continue to see this, it's going to take a long time for the marketplace to sort of catch up to this idea. We're sort of in that transitionary phase. So we're seeing the amount of demand, I think, potentially over the long haul, continuing to be slightly muted, but I'm not sure it's muted enough to take into account how much inventory we've got. In other words, we've got so many buyers out there now. Something like this would tend to indicate that once we sort of work through folks who are in this mindset, that we'd start to see a reduction in the number of buyers in the marketplace. And then at some place, that flow would just sort of become a little bit more natural in terms of seeing market demand levels sort of decrease a little bit. But inventory still isn't there, I think, to accommodate that. I don't think that we're in a place where we're seeing this be something we could point at and say that in the near term, it's likely to bring down prices. We still need to have some sort of an inventory boost for that to happen. But what is interesting is to then look at the other elements of real estate that play into this, right? What happens to lenders when buyers are not doing things on the cycle that we've become used to over the course of decades? Now, remember, I started doing this stuff back in the late 80s. And this whole 3 to 5 year thing has been gospel in real estate since long before that. I can remember my grandfather, who was in real estate, talking about that number. So this is a huge change. And I hear folks talk about it from the standpoint of sort of what the buyers are looking for and what that kind of means in terms of just what buyers are going to do. But that tends to also mean you're going to see a lot less frequent action in the lending world. The refinancing part will probably still be good, but the whole buying thing will go down. That typically means in those industries they're not making as much money because the fees are lower. It's one of those things that is definitely going to have an impact on the mortgage world. And one thing that concerns me there is then it becomes an enticement. If you find yourself in a position where you're not doing enough mortgage business, everyone seems to interpret that as a bad thing, and that's when you tend to get folks coming in and offering a lot of these weird things that tend to cause problems, whether you're talking about 3% down loans, 2%, 1%, 0%. in the desire to create activity so that businesses can make profit off of that activity. It just concerns me about the policies that could also come along. So there's a lot of different things wrapped into this number that I think are good to sort of bounce around in your head and think what sort of an effect they might have. And then as a buyer, seller, and investor, think, well, how is that going to affect my experience? And how do I potentially make myself stronger at what I'm doing because I know about this? So as a buyer, I think that tends to make you a little bit more in a position to buy if you're not tending to buy the home that everyone else is moving to. And we've talked about this before. Whenever I'm in a crowded marketplace, I stop shopping for the thing everyone else is looking for. So if you start seeing a trend like this, where buyers are tending to want to go for that bigger home or that home that's going to satisfy needs longer, well, by identifying what those are, you can potentially find the ones that might be getting seen less because they cater less to those long-term needs that people project they're going to have. And again, in a market like today where 3-bedroom, 2+ baths are the common search, start looking for that 2-bedroom. Start looking for that, as a minimum search I'll often do to try to find some interesting investment opportunities, I'll search for 2-bedroom, 1.5, sometimes even 1-bath homes, depending on the area. And then if I've got an opportunity to find a home that has a good size lot with a smaller home like that on it, the cost of adding those things to that home to make it more desirable, turning it into a 3-bedroom, adding some square footage, is less than what it would cost to go out and buy that home that already had that feature, right? Particularly in those tougher marketplaces. And that represents a great investment opportunity for you, whether you want to flip or rent. With rents the way they are now, potentially doing a remodel like that you'd normally do if you were planning on flipping to recoup those expenses, given the amount that rents are going for now in certain areas, that might be a more viable model for you, simply because here in this area, 2 bedrooms are already renting for ridiculous amounts. But if you were to, say, get a better deal on purchasing a 2-bedroom house in some markets here in Silicon Valley, and then you were able to convert that into a 3-bedroom, the amount of potential rent that you can get for that unit is ridiculously increased. So I think that might be a math problem that works out for you, given the amount you have invested in the property, and then figuring out what you're making off of that investment in terms of rental income on a month-to-month basis. So kind of keep that stuff in mind, and look for these changes in your local marketplace to have an effect on how things are getting sold. We may even see it during this transition period where we're sort of seeing the change from every 3 to 5 years to every 10 years being the cycle. There's always confusion, right? And there's always things start to happen differently. And if you're aware of it and you keep your eye out for it, there's a good chance you can take advantage of it and make it work for you, as other folks are kind of not really thinking that change has happened. They're sort of working off of the old dynamic, and then you could potentially make this insight work for you, whereas others aren't really going to see it. Right now, we're going to take a quick break, but when we get back, we're going to do some updates on some stories we've covered in the past. So stay right there.
Are you ready to jump in and start your search for your first investment property? Maybe you've decided that it's time to own your own home, or maybe you're ready to sell your home and move on to something new. No matter what your goal is, the Rebel Broker can help. That's right, aside from hosting this show, I am also the owner, broker of Whitelaw & Sons Real Estate Services right here in Silicon Valley. With over 25 years experience serving Silicon Valley, Morgan Hill, San Martin, and Gilroy, I or one of my great agents can help you achieve your goals in real estate. So if you're ready to look into taking that next step towards achieving your real estate goals, point your browser at www.soldbyrobert.com. That's www.soldbyrobert.com and get in touch. Let me show you how I will earn your business and your respect. Again, that's www.soldbyrobert.com, or you can call me at 408-852-0525. California Bureau of Real Estate ID 00984-909.
Welcome back, everyone. You know, we've mentioned on the phone before the effects of automation on the economy in terms of jobs. And we've always talked about how jobs are really at the core of really solving a host of problems, not just real estate problems. The bottom line is, in order to become a buyer, and we were just talking about this a minute ago, in terms of being able to buy, being employed to the point where you can afford to buy a house is a huge deal. So obviously, employment, the job scene, these are all things that play a big part in how dynamic our real estate market is in terms of creating buyers that are effective at completing a purchase. And so for a while now, I've been sort of discussing a topic that I think is going to play into this big as time moves forward, and that's automation. And one of the big areas that's starting off, that's sort of kicking this off, is in transportation, specifically in the self-driving car. Because the idea is that this is a thing that's going to eliminate a lot of the need for folks behind the wheel of a lot of different kinds of vehicles. And there were some interesting news items that came out. One or two of them relate specifically to things that are happening in terms of vehicles that are just going to drive themselves. Then also an interesting political take on how we're going to handle these quote-unquote robots. And we'll bring that up in a minute because it's kind of a doozy. The first one is from Rolls-Royce, and they're going to be cranking out remote-controlled cargo ships by 2020. And this is just a first step towards completely autonomous ships. So what I find amazing about this is their estimate that this is something that they're going to do within 5 years. And that's very short term. Now, remember, we've talked about articles before that have discussed the effect of automation and this type of stuff on the general employment scene, where they're talking 15 years, 20 years, 30 years for a lot of these things to kick in. And I've tried to make the point that I think we're on a much steeper curve as relates to this. So this is as much about sort of putting this in the top of your mind to think, how easy would it be to automate your job? And we've also talked about the different regulatory actions that take place that push this even further and make it even more desirable. For instance, we talked about the minimum wage being increased in so many areas, which really fed this idea for fast food restaurants to replace people. And so we've talked about in the past how kiosks are being created that replace the order takers. We've also seen stories about how the actual creation of the food, the actual cooking of the food, is going to happen from automation. It's going to be robots that do it. We've talked about trucking industry being one of the big ones, where that one mushrooms out huge, because you're not just talking about folks who are driving cargo from point A to point B. You're talking about all the people and services that existed between point A and B that provided services to those people that were doing it. Suddenly not having people to provide services to. Suddenly the folks they'd be providing services to would be just tourists. So all those truck stops that provide the place for a trucker to stop and sleep, take a shower, get some food, all of those things, and for those of you who've driven across the country, those things are a pretty big deal. I mean, they're big setups, and down the road, the idea here is two things are going to happen. One, there will not be a human in that vehicle, and two, the space that was previously put aside to handle a human being in the vehicle so they could sleep and have a place to live and do all these things while they're traveling will go away. So suddenly you'll have something that's going to be far more designed simply from going from point A to point B without having to worry about managing the needs of a human being in the vehicle. And so the range will increase. So the amount of time that those things actually need to stop and refuel or do other things is also going to be reduced. The only thing that may happen is you will suddenly see automated replacements for even folks who might have pumped that gas at these places, as these things will sort of electronically communicate with each other to take care of the need to refuel. So I think there's a lot of places in a lot of different segments of the employment landscape that are going to be affected by this. So and with this latest story from Engadget, we're seeing it already being pushed big, as in 4 years, from now, by 2020, having cargo ships being at the very least remote controlled. And again, remember, the step between being a remote controlled cargo ship and an autonomous cargo ship is a software upgrade. Because they're talking about remote control in terms of there's not a human on board the ship. There's a human at some specified land-based location the transition from making that not controlled by a human at all is literally a software upgrade. Because obviously all the things that are needed on the ship to assess the situation on the ship and all the other kinds of things are already there. So it's just a question of replacing that human person sitting in the chair then with automation software. So it's different than other revolutions, right? The Industrial Revolutions, you built a thing, and in order to get the next awesome version of that thing, someone had to invent it and build it. And new hardware had to be made. In this case, it's a software thing. You get people write software to make those changes. Next on the list, we've already talked about how trucking is being affected in a big way by automation. We've seen all kinds of examples from the number of drivers being reduced from, say, 6 to 1, where one driver is in the lead truck and there's 5 trucks following, and then those 5 trucks are just doing exactly what the first truck does. We've talked about autonomous trucks that don't need a human at all and can navigate from A to B. So there's a lot of different takes on this automation. Now we're seeing it in buses. Mercedes autonomous bus made a landmark trip on public roads. A driverless vehicle covered 20 kilometer route in the Netherlands. Mercedes-Benz City Pilot autonomous bus technology just got a real-world long-range test drive on the streets and highways of the Netherlands. One of the company's future bus vehicles successfully followed a 20-kilometer bus rapid transit route between Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport and the nearby town of Haarlem, navigating through tight turns, intersections, and pedestrian areas, all without the need for human input. The City Pilot platform is based on a version of Daimler's Highway Pilot autonomous trucking technology. We've talked about that before. There's also an article that I linked, I think, several months back relating to that, that's what's going to replace drivers in the United States, adapted to handle the specific needs of a city bus. Something else we talked about on this show was it's the software, right? So you're going to, when you get software feedback, when you get software data and you learn how to make your software better for trucking, you're going to learn things that are going to apply to a lot of different things. So the folks who are going to be able to benefit from what's been learned from the Highway Pilot autonomous trucking technology is obviously translating over into buses. It'll also translate over into your car. There are some cars driving around out there right now that with a software upgrade could become autonomous driving vehicles. I know Tesla is sort of the poster child for that technology, and I know that gets talked about quite a bit. But again, I think what's going to surprise most people is how quickly this kind of stuff is going to be able to happen, and you're going to see very big changes in the makeup of what humans are doing in a relatively quick time. We are absolutely the exact same kind of revolution in terms of workforce that we saw in the Industrial Revolution over 100 years ago. People are going to look back on this and be mind blown when they think back that someone was born before. They'll think about people who were born before automated vehicles the same way we think about people who were born and grew up before there were cars and they had to ride horses. I think it's that big of a change. Let's see. With GPS, radar, and a dozen cameras built into the vehicle, the bus can recognize traffic signals, pedestrians, and other obstacles. The bus has a top speed of 70 kilometers per hour, or about 43 miles per hour. And all that data taken together allows the bus to position itself within inches of bus stops or raised accessibility platforms. The biggest things that need to happen here are regulations that still require a human operator sit behind the wheel. In case of an emergency, the vehicle's intelligence systems make for a much smoother ride for everyone. Unlike other autonomous vehicles, the bus is actually connected to the city network, so it can communicate directly with traffic lights and other city infrastructure. And the only thing stopping this right now is regulation. And despite the fact that tends to be a problem, there is just so much potential profit for the city. This is one of those rare situations, I think, also where this is going to get fueled by the fact that doing these things makes the city more money. Being able to have community mass transit where there's no longer a human that you need to pay to sit in that seat, I think you can bet that there's going to be regulations put in that allow this to happen quicker. The vehicle itself is based on Mercedes' popular Citaro bus with a completely redesigned interior. Then none of that has anything to do with this, so we're not going to worry about it. The future bus isn't the first autonomous bus to start shuttling people around. It is the first to do so on a public transit system. a major milestone towards implementing driverless vehicles in cities around the world. So look for that to happen. So if you're somebody who is tied to this in some way, whether you're a driver, a bus driver, a truck driver, these are things I think you need to be aware of and take into account the fact that we're going to see a big shakeup in how folks earn their money, particularly if they're folks who work in these industries. And I think it's a good deal for every one of us, including me as a real estate guy, to think about how quickly will I be replaced by an automated system to do the same thing. And finally, the third article, or at least on this particular topic, robots to pay Social Security under EU tax proposal. Now, this, I think, the reason why I bring this one up is because I think it feeds perfectly into what I was just saying in terms of how regulations will absolutely quickly get modified in order to facilitate this process. The EU is studying a proposal that would count robots as people for tax purposes. So what's interesting about that? I don't see that happening in the U.S. anytime soon. The EU seems like just ripe, perfect kind of mindset territory for this sort of silliness to happen. I'm not sure that it will happen. But the idea here is that when you displace human workers with automation, well, one of the benefits to a business is you no longer have to pay, quote unquote, Social Security taxes. So they're passing these where these situations where a robot would be counted as a person, but no actual person will get any money. Just the business that owns that robot would then have to pay the equivalent of the Social Security tax to the state. Isn't that a sweet one? I don't see that happening here. I think the EU would actually have a very difficult time passing that. But it's definitely the kind of money grab that points out exactly how facilitating governments are going to be when it comes to this kind of an automation situation. Finally, I wanted to bring everybody up to date on what's going on with treasuries. Treasury yields fell to their lowest level ever a little while back, and we covered that here. And remember, we talk about how treasuries are linked directly to, not directly, treasuries tend to be a very reliable indicator of what's going to happen with mortgage rates. And they are currently at the lowest they've ever been. And I wanted to bring you up to date that I don't recall if we discussed this at the time that they actually hit their lowest point. Their lowest point was, let's see, what date does that say? That was on the 27th of last month. So it's a little bit higher now. It's currently at, let's see, 1.55, and its lowest point had been 1.46. So it went up a little bit and then went back down, and it's absolutely just dragging along the bottom here. And there are concerns. I've seen a couple of articles where folks are concerned that they'll go below zero. What happens if that occurs? So that's something that we're keeping an eye on in terms of things that we might want to be ready for. If we start to see this number go below zero, I'm not real sure what happens, but we'll keep an eye on it and give you any updates as they come. All right, folks, I hope you all have a great weekend planned. As always, I am forever in your debt for making this show part of your daily routine, and you've been a great audience in terms of helping me build the audience even further. The most recent numbers for the show absolutely reflect some great growth, and I completely put the credit for that with you in terms of helping me get the show growing. Again, if you'd like to get in contact with me, the best way to do that is to head over to the website at www.therebelbroker.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you all next time.